Hi, I'm Tony Stevens. This video you're about to see is on basic needle making. We're going to show you all the little tips and tricks on making your own needles. This will save you a lot of money in the long run rather than buying pre-made needles. Don't forget, if you're going to make your own needles, you need a good sterilizer. You can't make needles and use them on people just right out of the package. They have to be sterilized. These are some of the basic things you're going to need to start to make needles. You're going to need two different types of needle bars. You have flat needle bars and you have round needle bars. And these are, of course, for making flat needles, and these are going to be for the round ones. You're going to need a good eye loop. This is a 10 magnified one. It's 15 millimeter times 10. There's different types of tightening jigs, which we're going to get into all of this and explain what they do. This is simply a drill gauge that has different holes in it for different size drills, but it works perfect for tightening up the needles. This is a different type of tightening jig right here. It has different size holes for different types of needles. I use two different types of needles. I use a long taper and a short tapered needle, and I'm going to explain what we do with those. This device right here holds the bar in place so you can set your needles on it. These are grouping jigs, and you're going to need, of course, a good soldering iron, some flux, some solder, and you're going to use a single-edged razor blade to separate some of the needles out when we make some other needles, which we'll show you. And of course, sterilization pouches. After these needles are made, they're cleaned and then they're sterilized. You cannot make these needles and then just use them on a customer. They have to be sterilized. It's very important. Before we get started making the needles, let's try to explain a little bit of what's going to happen here. What you want to do is there's three different techniques to tattooing. There's line work, there's shading work, and there's color work. Each one of these techniques requires a different type of needle configuration. We're going to do some 3 needle outliners, 5 needle outliners, 7 needle round shaders, 14 needle round shaders, and we're going to make some flat shaders. There's also magnum shaders that you can make. Those are a little bit more elaborate and a little harder to make. In this video, I'm going to try to show you the basic needles that you need to make and work with. I'll get into how you make a magnum shader, and that's something you can always play around with. The idea of starting out when you make your needles is this would be the configurations, a top view of the needles, what it would look like. The idea is they have to be in some sort of a configuration of a circle. They can't be smashed together. If you're going to make a 3 outliner, when you set these in the jigs, they have to be 1, 2, 3 stacked like this. The jigs that we have that we're going to use, once you set the needles in there, they'll automatically almost fall into these configurations. But you should really know what it's supposed to look like. A 7 round should have 6 on the outside and 1 down the center. A 5 round is going to have 5 around the outside. You know, then 13s and 14s, you just keep building them up into circles for the round ones. Obviously, a flat shader, the needles will just be laying flat in a row. I spoke earlier about 2 different types of needles. There are plenty of different types of needles out there that you can buy. I'm going to show you what I use and the reason why I use them. There's different tapers on the needle tips, which is very simply how they're cut. I kind of colored this in white so you can see what I'm talking about. A long tapered needle is going to have just a longer taper, obviously, and the shorter one's got a shorter taper. I use the long tapered needles for outlining, and I use these short tapered needles when I'm doing color work. And the reason being, when you stack these needles next to each other in these configurations, the shorter stacks will, from the point to the next needle, will have a wider gap than when you put these together. These long tapers are good when you put 2 of them together and you push them into a needle jig. They'll actually come together to a nicer point than these short tapered ones. Some tattoo artists like to use one type of needle and that's all they use. And that's just a matter of preference. I'm going to go through this and I'm going to show you the way that I use them. I've been using them like this for the last 10 years and it's worked out perfectly fine for me. What I'm going to do is we're going to start out, I'm going to group up some 5s. We're going to make some 5 outliners first. And we'll go through each thing one at a time, each different type of needle we're going to make. Make sure your soldering iron's on and it's good and hot. I took the cap off of the flux bottle. I just, for this video here, I put a little bit of flux in there so you can see what we're going to do. You need to tin the soldering iron. If you buy a brand new soldering iron and you go to use it, it won't work because there's never been solder on the tip before. I just take a regular needle bar. These work great for putting little drops of anything on there. Just take a few drops of the flux and get it on the tip. You'll hear it start sizzling, and you see the smoke coming off it. You know it's good and hot. Then you're going to take a little bit of solder and just touch it to the tip of the needle, the soldering iron tip, the needle tip. And now it's tinned. It's got a little ball of solder sitting on there. Okay? And you can kind of set that aside. Okay, so we've got the soldering iron. We've got a little bit of solder on the end here. Okay? You want to take, and I'm going to use the long tapered needles. And what you want to do is just reach in there and grab some. And you're going to spread them out and make sure, you always have to make sure that all the points are pointed out. And that's where your eye loop is going to come in. So you want to count out, we're going to do a 5 here. We got a 5 jig, so we're going to count out 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Put the rest of them back you don't need. Try to keep them in these little packages like this because you don't want the tips getting bent at all. Take the needles and drop them in one of the holes. This particular jig is set up, you can make 10, 12 of these at one time. Once you've got the needles set into this little jig, they're going to actually just give them a very light little tap. You want to make sure that they're all even. This is the time you want to take your eye loop and you want to look through here and you want to look at the ends of these. Make sure you have the flat side of the needle is up, the points are down. Okay, because we're going to put we're just going to tack this together and make a group out of this. So dip into the flux with that, just take that needle bar like I showed you and just put a little drop of flux on the end. You don't have to get this thing soaked. Once you get a little bit of flux on the end, you should be able to touch that with the soldering iron. And now you've got a group of needles. It looks very simple to do this. It takes a little bit of finesse. You're going to have to work it a little bit. If you get a big ball of solder on the end of here, don't try to keep heating it up and trying to pick that solder off because it won't happen. You've got to be able to just, remember, a drop of flux and just touch the thing on there and that's it. What you're trying to do is just get these to stick together. Don't pull them out of this jig until they've cooled off for a couple seconds because you can burn your fingers, obviously. This is hot. Okay? Okay, now we're going to go to the next step here. You've got the needles sitting in a group here. You're going to probably want to make 4 or 5 of these at a time. You're not going to just want to do them one at a time, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to do them one at a time, make it simple. The next thing we're going to use, this is this particular device. This is just to hold the needle bar in place. The whole object of this is the needle bar has to be held in place. The needle is going to fit in this little groove here, and we're going to solder, obviously, the needles to the bar. So these things can be purchased at countless amount of tattoo supply houses. They're all different type they make that hold the bars. There's different shapes. They're made out of plexiglass, aluminum, stainless steel, and it doesn't matter whatever you want to use. This one has 3 holes in the back with a little pin, and the pin is going to go into the loop of the bar. The reason they do that is depending on what kind of machine you're using is going to depend on how long the needle is going to stick off the end of this and the type of bar you're going to have. This one works for me right in the center. So what we're going to do is we're going to put the needle bar on here, and it just sits right on there. One end's on there, and this is just laying. And you can see it's away from this little groove here. Okay. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to take that little group out of the jig, and you're going to lay it down in that groove. This is where you're going to do a little experimenting, and it depends on the type of tattoo machine you have and what kind of tubes you're using. This, if you can see the needle on here, the needle's sitting on top of the bar. Now, how far back do you set it on the bar? That depends on what type of machine you have. Once you put this needle bar into your tube and it's hooked to your machine, if you've got the tube back all the way into your machine and the needle's still hanging out the end, obviously you've soldered this needle on way too long on the bar. The space between here and here needs to be either lengthened or shortened. My particular machine, I set them back. I'm going to show you, you can see this. I'm not going to use a measurement. I just kind of know about right where it goes. So that's, That's the end of the bar is right here, and my needle ends right here. Remember, points are facing out, and now you've got that all set up, okay? Now, go back, dip into your flux again, and try to get a drop or two right on the bar and the needle, okay? And then you're going to get a little bit of solder. This is the tricky part. This is where you want to get it so you can reach in here. That's why they make this little opening. You can hold the two together, and you just want to put a little dot of solder on there. This is real important that you don't have a big blob of solder. That needle is now tacked to that bar, and that's the way it should be set up, okay? So now we can remove it out of here, and be very careful with this. I'm going to try to show this and see if you can see. The needle is just tacked onto the back of the bar, and now we're going to actually put some more solder around right here at the end. I'm going to show you here on this. You're going to put some solder right here from the end of the bar and around. And there's a real simple way to do this. You want to do is you always want to work with the flux. So put a little bit more flux on there, a couple little drops so it's wet. What you can do is you can almost, you see the little puddle of solder that's still sitting on my soldering iron? You can take that, lay it in there, and just roll it. And that's what it should look like when it's tacked onto the bar. Okay? You want to make sure that there's not a big ball of solder sitting here. There's not a big ball of solder sitting here. That's the way the thing should be tacked on. Now this is a 5. We're going to use this for, we're going to make an outliner out of this needle. So it's now the next thing that has to be done, it needs to be put into a needle jig, and the ends need to be pushed down to a point, and then we're going to solder up the shaft a little bit on here. And I'll show you how to do that next. What we're going to do now is we're going to make a point out of this. If you saw before, I was showing you there was different, this is a drill gauge, and there's several different holes. Obviously you don't want one that when you put the needles into the hole it goes right through the jig, because that's not going to taper the point down and make any type of a point. You're going to want one of the smaller holes. I'm going to use probably something on a drill gauge. It's marked 68 and it's 0.031 millimeters. So the object of this is we're going to get the needles very carefully. You're going to have to get them into that hole, and once you get them into the hole, then we're going to solder back onto this shaft. This type of a needle gauge has the same thing. This is a tightening jig also. It may be a little hard to see on here, but it starts out with a very large hole that you can see. I can put the needle right through it, and then it just keeps tapering down. This one will go all the way down to if you're using 3s, 5s, 7s, whatever you need to do to taper down the needles. You can solder it in. Same thing. You just basically, you're going to put this, you're going to set your needles up into the hole very carefully so you don't bend them. And then you're going to gently, you're going to be pushing into it. The way I do this is you actually take the needle bar, put it on your chest right here, and kind of just jiggle it around a little bit till you got that thing in there pretty tight, okay? Then you want to take a little bit of flux, put it on the shaft of the needle, and then you want to just lay some real nice solder in there. And I mean, if you just run it up and down, you don't want any balls of solder on there. When this thing is finished, what you want to have, I'm going to pull it out of the jig, you want to have a very smooth soldered, almost to the tip. You're going to go, I'm going to put this little thing in here because it's probably hard to see where the solder ends and the point starts. I soldered it right to here. So this part was stuck into the jig and it tapered down all the needles, okay? You really don't want to have, I'm going to show you what it's not supposed to look like on this particular needle. As long as I made it now, it looks right. You don't ever want to have where you've got a big ball of solder sitting anywhere. When you look at that thing, you don't want to see any lumps. You don't want to see any big gobs of solder like sitting here where you join the shaft to the needle. You have to remember, this is going to run through the tube, okay? So if you've got, like here, there's big lumps and balls of solder on here and stuff like this, it's not going to run smooth in the machine. When this thing's trying to go through the tube, it's going to be up and down, it's going to be shaking. Some of them might not even fit through the hole in your tube. So you're going to have a real problem with that too. So when you're done with that, there can't be any lumps at all. If you wind up with a small lump in there like this, sometimes you can just take the soldering iron and you can just run it back and forth, and it'll pick up that loose solder. I can even smooth this side out right here if I needed to. Now I got a nice smooth piece of solder here. I got smooth solder here. You got to remember something. If you ever touch this with the soldering iron, you don't want to do it all the way up and down the shaft, because then you'll loosen all the solder and you'll lose the point on it. Once you start making needles, you should never have to do that. You have to practice, so when you pull it out of the jig, it's done. You know, this thing should be fitting in here. I showed you on that other jig. I'll show you on this one. It's basically the same thing. I put it in the hole. You can see that the needle comes through the backside just a little bit, and it's tightening up all the things. I put it on my chest like this, push in there gently, take the soldering iron and just run it back up and down the shaft like this onto the group that you have. Don't pull it out of here too quick, because you want that solder to cool for a second. Then you can pull it out, and that's the needle, and it's made. The next thing you're going to do with this, you're going to take an alcohol swab or some alcohol. You're going to clean this whole thing off, because there may be flux, a little bit of residue on there. Then it's going to go, after it's cleaned real good, then it goes into the sterilization bag and it gets put into your autoclave. Okay, what we're going to do now I'm going to switch these grouping jigs here, and I'm going to make some 7 shader needles out of this. These are going to be made pretty much the same way. It's a good thing to keep watching, because you're going to want to know how all this is done. This one you can take, I'm going to use those the short tapered needles, and those I always use those for shaders. They just, like I said before, they work a little bit better. So I'm going to open that package of these things up. I'll tell you a good little trick if you want to know when you're messing around with a lot of needles like this. If you have a refrigerator magnet, a square refrigerator magnet, these are the metal on here will stick, so when you lay them down on here, they won't start rolling and falling all over the place. You can pick them back up with a refrigerator magnet, or work on a refrigerator magnet. It actually works fine. Any kind of a little sheet of magnet will work. So what you want to do with this, we'll take out 7 of these, and we're going to set these in the group. So again, fan them out and make sure you count them out. They seem a little awkward to count with, but it's not too bad. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 needles. We'll put the other ones back in the package, and then we'll set them up into this little jig. And again, you could probably make, 9 or 10 of these. There's several different companies that sell these grouping jigs. They don't all look like this, but you'll be able to see once you buy this stuff. Start looking for what you're going to buy. You'll see all different kinds of them. Some of them will hold 3, 4 groups at a time. Some hold 10. I like to use, when I make them, normally I'll make 10 at a time. This saves a lot of time. A little bit of solder, a little bit of flux on there before you do the solder. And again, you might want to tin that soldering iron a little bit. And don't put big globs of solder on there again. Just enough so it gets onto the end. Make sure the needles are all pushed down and they look even. Don't push these too hard, because you don't want to bend the tips. These are made out of plastic, and they really won't wreck your tips, but you just want to be careful with it. And then just hit it again, tack it. That's all you're doing, is you're just tacking that group together. If you think that you're putting the solder on and you're just getting a little dot on the top, and you're having problems pulling them out of here, and they seem like you're afraid they're going to separate, you can go down the shaft just a little bit. Don't go down too far, but you can put a little bit of solder down the sides, okay? And again, wait till it cools off a little bit before you go grabbing it. They cool pretty quick. And you take that out, and you should have a nice group. This is a time you can take, even with the 5s, this is when you can take your eye loop again. Look at the pointed ends of these. Make sure all of the points are nice and even. There's not one higher than the other. They should all be even in a row, okay? They should all be nice. The configuration should look round. The needles are all even. And then we're going to do the same thing again. We're going to set this up on the jig. Put a needle bar in here. Here's a real good thing to know. When you set your needles, your bar into the jig here, this loop should always be facing you. Okay? You don't want to put them on here this way. It would be backwards. Okay? The open end of the loop always faces this way. Okay? Then you can lock that in there again. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to set this on Just set that right back in the groove. This particular jig has different grooves for making different types of needles. This one here, the groove that I'm using on this one, this is made, you can put it probably up to a 14 round in here, and it'll sit in that little groove real nice and even, okay? So again, set the needle back on there again. And like I said, I'm going to set this back right about to here, okay? So here's the end of the bar, here's how far back I got the needle set, okay? And then you want to add a little bit of flux on there again. Just a drop or two. You'll see when you put the flux on there, that flux kind of runs up to the shaft of the needle. It runs into the tubes. I don't know if you can see it going, but that's what it does. And then again, hold them very gently together so they're nice and even on the bar. And then you want to just tack it on. And now that's tacked on. Okay? Okay, now you've got that tacked onto the back, so we can take that out of the jig. And we're going to do the same thing again, just like we did with the other one. You've got to get some solder between here and here. You've got to get this on there better. It's just barely tacked onto that bar. So again, a little bit more flux. Make sure you got enough solder on the end of your soldering iron. And I'm going to try to show you this here. Again, there's several ways to put this on. You could go like this. You could put that solder on back and forth a little bit, and then just kind of roll it in your fingers. Roll that whole needle bar. So you got a nice little channel of solder in there, and it's holding this needle onto that bar real good, okay? Don't go back too far with the soldering iron because this is hot liquid solder. If you hit the little tack at the back, it'll drop right off. You'll lose the whole thing. The only difference now is you're not going to take this needle here because this is going to be a shader, so we want the tips, we want them loose. We don't want them pushed into a point. This is it's a round shader. So what you're going to want to do is, again, you can still use this little tightening jig, but you're going to look for a looser hole, and you're going to put the needles in here. The idea of this is just to keep them round, so they stay nice and round and they hold together, okay? I'm going to try to set this up so you can see me do this real good. I'm not going to do this one on. You can put this on your chest like this and hold this together. And this time you're only going to put a little flux on there. Put some flux on the needles, and then you want to hit that with the soldering iron just up and down the shaft like this. And I'm going to show you. Don't pull it out yet. Wait for a second till the solder cools, then pull it out. This time on a shader, what I did is I soldered from here to here, and I left this much not soldered. You want this loose at the end. The idea is so when you're shading, obviously, you've got the tips aren't to a point. You've got more of a group that's shaded. Take your eye loop, look in there again, check, make sure you've got every single point showing. You don't have one needle in there backwards. That's a real common mistake when people buy needles or make their own needles. I've purchased needles from companies that are pre-made, and people just assume that they're okay. They don't check them with an eye loop. And the manufacturer will have one needle in there backwards, and you got a flat end. And that's when you can really tear somebody up big time. So if you ever start doing a tattoo and the ink's not going in right, get your eye loop out. I guarantee you got a needle in there backwards. Okay? And that's how you make a 7 shader. We're going to make a 14 round shader. Remember before I was talking to you about a refrigerator magnet? You could take anything like this. This is one of those little flexible magnets like this. You can see if you touch it onto these needles, it'll pick them right up. Okay? So if you're working on a spot, this is a good way to keep your needles too. These little containers that they come in, they're plastic, and as soon as you bump them or something, the needles all go flying all over and you got a big mess on your hands. So if you pick your needles up like this, you can actually count them out, separate them out, however you need to do them, when you're going to make them. I'll show you with a 14. We'll take 14. We'll take a bunch of them. If they fell on the ground like that, you could just pretty much just roll that thing over it, and you can pick up almost all your needles right away. You can get them right back up into some sort of a thing. Just roll them around on the magnet till you get them flat. And this is good now because I'm going to show you what happens when they go frontwards or backwards. And you can get rid of some of these. We don't need all these. Okay. You can pretty much just roll them out and count them out that way. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. We got 15 on here, so you can get rid of one. Then you can just roll them right off into your hand like this. Be careful with the needles; they're sharp. Spread them out in your fingers again. You can eye loop them right here in your hand if you need to. Take your eye loop and look and make sure you've got all the ends facing the right way. After a while, you'll be able to see them in your hand. I've been making needles for a long time, so I can tell when they're backwards. You'll be able to see the taper's not in there. Okay? So we got 14 needles. So we'll stick them in one of the 14 needle holes. Here's another thing to consider when you're making any type of needle. All of these jigs, the most important part of this needle thing is that once you put them through the jig, that this base right here is perfectly smooth and perfectly flat. Because when you tap these needles down and you tack them, you want to make sure that all those needles are lining up good. So if this thing was milled wrong or cut different and you're not getting a real smooth thing, you could cut a little piece of plexiglass and put it in there, or you can even send it back to the manufacturer and tell them that it's not grouping your needles right, that they're not setting down in the jig correctly. But that's how they should go. They should all be nice and even and set down on there, okay? So 14 is the same thing. Make sure they're in there nice and round. They're not oval shaped. They should fit in that hole perfect. Over the years, if you keep using these, what will happen is these holes will start to wear out. So you have to watch it. If your needles aren't coming out in a nice round shape anymore, it's time to buy a new jig. Spend the money and get another one, because it's important. So we're going to do the same thing again. Put a little bit of solder on there. I know you've seen this a couple times, and it's a good thing to keep watching. Put a little bit on there, and just a very little bit of solder is all you need, because you're just tacking it. And you're going to do the same thing. You're going to tack this all together, okay? And then we'll show you how to mount this on the bar. Okay, so we've got this all tacked on here now. It's cooled down a little bit. Back to the same thing. Put the needle bar in. Remember, make sure the loop is facing you. Take it out of there, set it into the groove. A lot of people are going to probably want to know, what's that measurement between this and how far back this needle sits? Does it sit here? Does it sit there? And I'm telling you, you have to make a couple needles and hook them onto your machine, set the tube in there, make sure that it fits right, it's not hanging out of the tube when your tube is in the machine. So that's something that there's not an actual measurement for. It's got to be according to the type of machine you're using. You'll know how far back to set that needle on the bar. Okay? So the same thing, put the flux on, a little bit of solder, and just, you want to hold them together gently and tack them on. And you see how you can see how that solder kind of just, especially when you get to these bigger groups like this, because you're putting a little bit more solder on. That solder, you want it to taper back like that. So once you touch it with the soldering iron, just kind of pull it off and away. And that should be on there. Once it cools, again, you can take it off of there. And that's what it should look like tacked onto the bar. It should be a real clean, smooth. You'll know when you got a good solder joint. The solder should be very shiny. If the solder is all foggy looking and it's dull, that means the soldering iron probably wasn't hot enough, or you're not using the right kind of solder. So buy your solder and your flux from a tattoo supply place, because they know the right stuff to use. And now we're going to solder up the shaft of this again. So we want to put some flux on here. Don't forget, now you're using a 14, so you probably want to put a few more drops of flux. You want to get enough flux on there. And you can basically, again, you can do it two ways. You can just tack that on and roll it like I was doing before, and just kind of roll that through your hand like this until you get solder all the way around to both sides, and make sure you got a nice smooth joint. You want that to be nice and smooth. See the little lump there? You don't want any lumps in your thing, on your needle. So just smooth them out with the soldering iron. The way this thing is made is going to depend on how it puts the color in. If you take the solder and you run it all the way up to here, it's going to keep these needles together really tight, and you're not going to get as much color going in at one time. If you only solder about halfway up You're going to leave these a little bit looser. They shade real nice like that. There's another little trick that guys will do with these when you got this many needles. You could take the razor blade and you could actually put it in between some of these. You should do this with an eye loop and actually look at it. And you can kind of go in between the needles and kind of bend them. You're not really bending them hard. You're just kind of stretching them out a little bit. It'll take the needle group and it'll open it up a little bit. It'll hold more ink and it'll put it in faster. A lot of guys like to do that for brush shading and stuff like that. This thing basically will do the same thing as a flat shader if you have it made right. Now I'll show you how to make some flat shaders, okay? And of course on this one you're going to use the flat bars. When you buy these needle bars, here's another thing too. If you notice, they had different loop ends on them. Some of them have this type of an end, some of them are round. These come in all different sizes and shapes too, and that's just a matter of preference, what fits better onto your machine. You put a grommet in here. If the grommets don't fit, you can open these up a little bit with a screwdriver if you had to. Just try to find ones that fit in your machine good, okay? So we're gonna take this one, we're gonna do a flat, and I'm gonna make a 7 flat. So I've got 7 of those needles set out here. This one's a little trickier to make when you're going to make flat shaders. This particular jig right here, in fact, I'm going to put it on top of here so you can see it a little better. This has got 2 different slots in it. This one will hold a few more needles. This probably will hold 14, and this one will hold 7, this long shaft here. So what you want to do is you're going to have to tack these together so they're flat. You're going to want to lay them into this groove. Okay, so they sit in there real nice. Take that razor that you had, and you want to push these till you got them perfectly flat. This is not the pointed end. The pointed end is facing in here. This is the flat end that we're going to tack with solder, okay? So you want to make sure they're all laying in there nice and flat and even, okay? And basically you're going to do the same thing. You're going to tack the ends of this. A little bit different way to tack it. Put a little bit of flux on there. Get a little bit of solder. And you want to do is you want to just kind of, when I put the solder on, I'm going to kind of roll it out. Just like that. Okay? And then just don't let go of it for a minute. Hold it until that, you'll see the solder change. You'll see it kind of flash, and then you know it's cool enough and the needles are tacked together, okay? And then you'll have all your needles tacked together like that, okay? If you find that when you're buying your needles, after you flatten them on this end, you turn them over to the end that you're going to use, and you find out that they're not even, that means that the manufacturer buying your needles is not cutting the needles exactly the same. So what you're going to do is, if you're going to make flat shaders like this, you're going to have to lay it in this jig, and you're going to have to tap it flat on this side, and then check over here. If it doesn't look right, just take the razor blade back onto the point side and push it till they're all nice and even, because that's the important end that's even, is the side that you're going to actually be sticking into people, okay? Now we'll set this back up onto the needle jig. Same thing, loop always faces you, and lock this flat bar in there, okay? And just make sure that it's sitting nice and flat in the jig, so everything is, you're gonna lay your needles right on top of that little flat one. And basically do the same thing. This time you can start out, you can put a little bit of flux on this bar first, because it's a longer shaft. And then you're going to lay this right into there, okay? And you're going to tack that one onto the bar. I'm trying not to get my hands in the way here too much. You may be holding this a little bit different when you do it, but I want you to be able to see what I'm going to do here. And again, tack that onto the bar, okay? Okay, so now it's cool, and we can take it out of the holder here. You know, this particular device that I'm using here, there's several different ones. I mentioned that before. Some are made out of plexiglass. This little, the thing that's holding your needles in it, some of them have them on 2 shafts, and once you put the needle on there, you can slide that forward till it meets the bar. Once you get ready to start buying some of this, these different products, you'll look, and they're pretty self-explanatory when you look at them. They have all these different little things that you can change, and they're for all different kinds of needles to make. So, all right, so now we've got the flat needles tacked onto the back of this bar, and you're going to do the same thing again, almost like you did with the round ones. You're going to put some flux on here. This time, you're going to tack the top of it. You're going to go over the top of it with some solder, turn it, and get a little bit on the sides. And on this side of it, where the bar meets the needle, you want to try to get a little bit of solder in there. You may have to reflux this and hit it twice when you're making a flat bar. Flat needles are a little bit more work actually to make than the round ones. There's a little bit more playing around with the solder, but you'll get it. Same thing, a little bit of solder on there so the solder is going from here to the needles. Okay? Again, now you can solder up this shaft a little bit. If you want to hold that group together a little tighter, you can just slide that some solder up on top of there. Again, no balls. It can't have big lumps of solder. It's got to be nice and smooth because that's going to be running through the tube. Okay. This particular one, this shader bar, you can leave it just like it is. Or again, a lot of guys like to take them and they go in between each needle one at a time with the razor blade. Just lift each needle and you have to bend it out just a little bit. And what you want to do is you don't want to go each one in a row, up, up, up. You want to bend this one up, then you want to turn the bar to the other side and do that one. And then go back to this side. What you're going to wind up doing is taking those flat needles and kind of fanning them out a little bit. It'll definitely pick up more color and it'll give you an easier way to shade with. I talked about magnums before. A lot of guys use magnum shaders. A lot of guys don't use them. A magnum shader is basically made the same way we just did this, except there's another set of needles on top, and you'll put a razor blade between them when you tack them. Okay, and you can get those needles. You can almost take a razor blade and weave it up and down, in and out of each one to make a magnum shader. If you've ever purchased a magnum already made, you can take a look at it, buy one or two of them, look at the way they're made. Now that you know how to make needles yourself, you can buy some of the different ones that they have. They've got so many different types of configurations that you can buy. So if you're not sure how to make that one, I guarantee everything you have here, you can make any kind of needle they make. So purchase one or two pre-made needles for a couple dollars and take a good look at it and see how it's made and how it's put together and where it's soldered, and just make them yourself.